star. Elegant, 10 years, etc. Okay, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to redo what we've done last week. So when I'm dealing with this research design, there's two other sessions that you can look for. The one is the one that we did on the 9th of May, okay, that has been recorded. But the one that it did on the 19th of May, number 12, has not been recorded. But this is pretty much what we've done on the 19th. However, I'm going to probably deal with some things in more detail, etc., because we're much smaller. Okay, I don't talk to it. It doesn't want to listen to me. Something is not happy.
It's meant to install the software. So maybe just check, it takes a while to install the software.
Okay, you can start again, please. I don't. The design is I'm doing a recap. The purpose of this is that we're going through research design from a variety of perspectives. I've gone through what should be in a research design on the 9th of May. That's session 6, and that's available. I've also gone through it again on the 12th. Now, one of the important bits is when you put together your final proposal, your research design indicates to the university if you know how you're going to go around reaching your objectives empirically. And it is very, very important. The moment you start finalizing that research design, you want to know that you can actually execute it as well. So your research design is very clearly linked to your problem statement. It has to have congruence, and it's also linked to your ability to execute it. And you'll be going up and down, and you'll be fiddling with these things up and down until you can get it out so that it actually works. So what I'm going to do is I'm really going to deal with what we have done and why it comes from. Now, some of you have done assignment 3, some of you have not done it. But fundamentally, the logic about assignment 3 is unpacking your research problem so that you understand how you're going to go around answering it. We are not saying that you should know, you should simplify it. We should saying that you should really understand what is in that problem. Because the moment you've unpacked it, you know what to do it. So you need to take your research problem, which has to be a research problem and not a consulting problem, and you then have to go around it and change that into a research question. Your research problem is basically a lot more complex and woolly, but when you start putting it in your research question, you are cleaning it up. And you're putting it into a research question that can be answered by research. Within that single question, there are a multitude of questions that you need to be able to answer in order to address all the possible nuances within your research question. And what assignment 3 is about generating these questions and making decisions about it. You need to decide that some of those questions are going to be outside of your study. You're not going to do that. So you're just delineating them out, or you're just putting them outside of your scope. Then, after you've done all these questions, and we'll get to some of those questions now, you have to decide, okay, what am I actually going to do? Am I going to answer this question, and can I answer it out of the literature first? If this is a question that's important in my argument to answer, I use literature. If there's not enough literature in your M level, there must be limited literature. Around the doctorate level, no literature. Then this is my research or my empirical sub-question. If I'm not going to answer that question, but it's still in there, I might want to make assumptions about it. So I've got to build the argument, and I have to have some answer in my argument to answer the question. Or I'm not going to be able to answer it at all, so there's a limitation in my ability to answer the question. Okay. And from this, what we then want to do, and it's very important that every single one of you go around to do that, you've got to say, under my boundary conditions, I can answer this research question. But to answer the research question, I must have certain bits of literature that I bring into my argument, and then I've got to bring some empirical evidence. And if I add all of this together, I can answer my research question. Now, it's very important to know that there's no ways that you can answer something by simply pulling the things together out of a survey or some empirical evidence. You need to bring in the current body of knowledge, because your research is grounded on academic work. You want to extend, create new knowledge. So you need to know what is actually currently set. Your chapter 3 or your chapter 2, which is your literature review, and we've spoken about that, really puts the stage in how you're going to go to answer the question. It tells you what are the literature answers, and it also gives you the background to each one of these research questions. So that when you get to that research sub-question, you should know, what should I measure? From your literature, you'll know what questions to ask, in what way to analyze. And unless it, you can't. Now, the reality is, if you're putting together your research design, it should be congruent. It should make sense in the way that you've positioned your whole research. Fundamentally, there are certain underlying things about ontology and epistemology that you actually believe in. Now, at a master's level, you should really actually be aware of what you're doing, but at a doctoral level, you should fully understand the implications of your ontological and your epistemological viewpoint. In some textbooks, they refer to this as paradigms. In some textbooks, they talk to that as your philosophical approach, but it basically deals with the first question: what is truth? And we've gone through this example. Which one of those do you see as a bird? And people have different versions. In fact, what is your understanding? Or do you actually see that as a root signature or a little girl jumping out of a cake? What's a bird? Now, the next tier, and this is probably where most of your decisions is going to go, is around, what do you think about knowledge? How do you think knowledge is built? From what does knowledge come from? And there's two sides to it. The one side is your typical old view of it, positivism, in some cases spoken to as new positivism, and it basically says that knowledge is value-free. I can observe it, I can say, and this is it. In other words, I can measure it, there's nothing around its context is important. If this is true, it's true in all cases. And your typical research, your science research, etc., comes in this sphere. I can prove something. On the other side, from a interpretivism, constructivist perspective, I'm saying that the way that I experience knowledge is really important. It has always got something to do with the context in which it's experienced. It can only be perceived. So knowledge is only about what people perceived in a specific context. Those are the two extremes. In a management environment, you are probably going to deal with a positivist kind of research. The guys going more into economic sides, looking at econometrics, those kind of things, is a very positive approach. Or you're going to move into critical realism, but you're not, you may go fully into an interpretivism perspective. One of the other things, and most of you have dealt with that, is not only about what do you perceive to be knowledge, but what do you want to do with it? Why do you want to know? And typically, if what you want to know is to explain something, it's more likely to be a positivist way. If you want to understand something, it's going to be more likely to go from an interpretivist kind of perspective. in the middle, the whole theory about critical realism is saying that in fact, knowledge has to be used. And there's a whole area, probably the Bobby and Maton text is the best about that really deals with knowledge in order to change it. Marx being typically referred to, looking at social change, but you would deal at social change. You could actually look at a transformatory perspective that looking at other forms of using your knowledge. So the very simple meaning about what you want to do with knowledge really has to be congruent with your problem and congruent with the way that you're going to go about generating the knowledge. If you want to explain, you're going to generate the knowledge in some way. If you understand, you generate it some way. And if you want to change, you're going to generate it differently. And there are certain designs that are more aligned with one side, more aligned with the other side. And there are transformative designs that are fundamentally in the middle. So the way that you phrase your problem, your research problem, the way that you phrase your question has some level of congruence about how you look at knowledge. Basically, in the middle is the transformatory, emancipatory things about change. And a number of you are really looking at that side. Now, if you look at your positivist, your new positivist kind of perspective, it really tells you that there's a chain of reasoning. And your basic way that you explain it is linked to previous studies. You understand your hypothesis and your questions and your models. You design it. You get a lot of evidence together, you do the analysis, it's linked to the conclusion, and at the end of your conclusion, you put your next study together. So all of research forms into a chain, and although they talk about it as a chain, you can see that it's really a total net, and it links into each other. Now, the moment you look at it like that, it appears that if you start with research, you put it, it's clear, and we proceed to the next step. This is not true. Research is really very, very messy, and it's very iterative. And in fact, you very, very seldom finish one decision and move to the next one. You continue to change your decisions, and you actually go around changing those until the very moment that you hand in the last step. So although we pretend in our document that we've gone through it, we've looked at the literature, we did our empirical studies, and wow, we got our answer, the reality is that's not the way research works. I go through this many times, I change, I fiddle, I try and phrase it, and then I write it up logically, I write it up linearly, and we all pretend that this is the way it happened. And that's probably one of the areas where students that are busy with their proposals really struggle. Because you're not getting that clarity, are you? You're not getting to the point that this is the problem, go forth and do that. Now, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get you to continuously move up and down the chain so that by the time your proposal is finished, and up to here is really your proposal, that part, that you just can go around executing it. So I'm continuously taking you back onto things. So overall, from your U project, U model, problem area, your research problem, you describe it, get your literature, you work out how to get your empirical evidence. That part you've got in your proposal. But what you want to do is you want to make sure in your proposal that you can just get the evidence and then actually put together your argument. So what is there in chapter 4 in your more traditional design, where chapter 1 is your introduction, chapter 2 is your literature, chapter 3 is your research design, you know what you're going to do. You're not sitting there, oops, now I have the evidence, what now? We want you to be able to do that very logically, and we want you to then go, going back. And we want you to then conclude from that and see where you're contributing. So in the end, your chapter 5, which is that part, you map here and you've got it solidly. So although it might seem like a lot of checks and balances, we want you to be, by the time you've got your proposal ready, to be nearly at the point that you can paint by number. Okay, so logically your argument flows in that way. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Chapter 4. However, we know that you're going cyclical about that. And you're fiddling and you're moving and you're changing and you're going up and around there. Fundamentally, you're working on your golden thread. A golden thread is not something, and that is probably one of the arguments that very often gets given to people that are busy with the that are being examined, is there's no golden thread. I don't know where you start. I cannot follow your argument because you're moving around, you're changing directions in your work. Okay. You need to be able to make sure that there's an absolutely golden thread. And your research design, in other words, the way you move from your problem to getting the reality, is very important there. It's got to be congruent. When you're finished with the whole thing, you cut it open and you write down chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, whatever, and it looks beautiful. It looks logical, it follows, etc. But that golden thread is not something you add in afterwards, it's something that has to be put in. And it gets anchored around your problem. So we go around and we go problem, 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 problem. Research problem, not a consulting problem. What is it? Now your problem is the anchor of that golden thread, and your problem determines a lot of things. So from your problem you work out how you're going to do the research and actually arguing it. And if you find out that you can't get the evidence, you've got to go back and you've got to adjust the problem, because you've got to get a problem that is researchable. Doesn't help to have a beautiful problem, but you can't go around answering it. Okay? You can't go addressing it, sorry. And it also doesn't help that you have a problem that has 4, 5, or 6 different degree issues in it. You've got to find something that's at the right level, that is a scope sufficiently so that you can do it, that you can get the evidence for, etc. Now what you've done in your 150 words or your abstract, some of you have done it, is you've basically already articulating your problem and you've registered a title and you've given the aim of your research. The reality of that is that the words you use in your title are the same words that you have in your research problem. So the moment a person reads your title, they start following that golden thread. If by the time you've worked through your proposal and you want to hand in your 12-page proposal, you work out that maybe that's no longer my research problem and that research title is out of alignment, you have to go and re-register your title. It's a pain, it's a lot of paperwork. So we want you to, by the time that you hand in your proposal, maybe have a separate new 150 word, because your 150 word is what you use to register your abstract or your title in there, so it's there. So we'll make you go again and again and again on this thing, because you don't really want to have to go back before you hand in your document and then register a title. And a lot of people go then back and re-register a title the further and further they are in advance, because they're finding out that the research problem wasn't practical. Okay. These are the criteria of a research problem. All of you have been spoken to about research problem. One of the practical issues is it's got to be relevant in your discipline. You might find a perfectly lovely research problem, but it's not relevant in the discipline that you registered for. And your supervisors will tell you, you know, you can try and do that, but that's not a marketing problem. And you cannot get a master's in marketing if you address that problem. And it's very, very important. I mean, some of you have walked up and down there. Next one, is it real? Can I substantiate that out of empirical evidence? This is really an issue. Remember, most of you in a management type concern, and in the body of knowledge, in the literature, is that a problem? And at the doctoral level, will I make a significant contribution to the knowledge? All of these are important. The next thing that's important, who owns the problem? You might be sitting and you might be articulating a problem from a management perspective without understanding who else might be experiencing that problem, and you building up, answering that problem, reaching, contributing, wah, wah, wah. And people look at this and say, you know what? It's not good enough, because what about? So whenever you look at the problem, you might really want to look at who could possibly be owning that problem and what does that mean. You want to get something that you can get some benefit about, preferably, I mean, especially if you're studying part-time, you want to get some benefit in your work environment from this. What is it that you're going to do? Oops. The next thing, you want to live with the problem for 1 year, 2 years, however long you do it, and we hope that by the time you've got a detailed research proposal, a master's should be able to be done in less than a year. You've got the plan, you know exactly what to do, you're merely going out to get the evidence. And then can I have a supervisor? That becomes quite a serious issue if your supervisor may have experience in a slightly linked area. And then, can I do it? If you're not able to do it, be either because you can't get access to the data, or you can't analyze that form of data, or because it's just going to be so much work that I can't finish it in the required time, then there's no point in having that problem, is there? Okay. There are different kind of questions. Now, within your problem is your research question. There are questions, and these are the empirical group. Most of you, in fact, the requirement at TUT is that you do empirical questions, that you're not doing other level of question. So you might be doing exploratory kind of research. What factors underlie? This is, I'm trying to explore, I'm trying to get evidence. You might want to describe what is the relationship between these guys? What is the influence? Things very descriptive. Now remember, the moment that you're dealing with descriptive kind of knowledge, you're probably epistemologically looking from a positive perspective. Causal questions. Why? What are the causes of? Traditionally, many people would put your causal questions into your positivist perspective, but you can actually deal with causes in very many other ways. And if you do qualitative work, the way that you deal with causal work would be by developing different explanations, different kind of things. We'll go through that now. You can do evaluative questions, you can have predictive questions, or you can have historical questions. Okay. There are also questions that are coming as non-empiric questions. Now, you can do that. There's some really meaningful research. But if this is not likely to going to satisfy the requirements for your degree, it's a bit wasteful to go that way. Meta-analytical question. Meta-analysis, typically, you are looking at other research and you're analyzing other people's research, other people's empirical evidence to come up with the overall thing. Conceptual questions tend to be a little bit difficult to deal with empirically. Theoretical questions, a lot of the theoretical work that one does, you're not really bringing in evidence. You're conceptualizing, you're sitting there, you're looking at the sky, and you're thinking of beautiful high-level thoughts. And then also philosophical questions. These are sensible questions, these are real questions, but they are not always practical questions to base your research for degree on. Okay. Now remember, I spoke about assignment 3. This is where you now look at your overarching question. Now, many of you are making the mistake that you're saying, this is my research problem, and then I immediately phrase different questions. You've got to translate your research problem in your single primary research question. And all the other ones are in order to answer that question, because if you have multiple questions, it becomes difficult to structure your research project, and it's less clean and it's very complicated. Now, when you look at all of your little questions and you've broken all the possible bits that I can ask in order to answer my primary question, I am going to really start scratching open that question. So the ones of you that have done assignment 3 may want to re-look at this when you start looking. You want to know, all of these things is, can I actually do the research? Is it a qualitative kind of thing? Is it quantitative? In what paradigm does it fall? All of those kind of questions. Then you want to know, on this specific questions, are there going to be real ethical issues if I answer it? The next thing is, what is the theoretical grounding? What literature exists on this? If it's already been answered in the literature, I can't make it my empirical question, unless there are certain limitations as to how it's been answered. What data exist? Is that in people's knowledge? Is it in documents? Where do I have data? And possibly in some cases you will have multiple sources of data. And in many cases you have multiple sources of data. And you want to know if you have ethical access to that. There's no point in, I know this, but I cannot go around writing this documentation that I have access to because it's company secrets, or something that I can't go around accessing and putting together, or by using that evidence and writing it down, I'm putting somebody or some organization at risk. Can I have instruments? How am I going to measure it? How am I going to determine either measurement in a form of a positivist instrument or in your analytical frameworks? How am I going to deal with that? How am I going to analyze it in the end? What am I going to do with it? Can I answer it? And then do you have the skills? Now, there's no point in saying I'm going to do a deep quantitative study when you know that your feeling towards statistics is a bit suspect. Or I'm going to really go into a very phenomenological study when actually you don't like interviews and dealing with people and understanding deeper things. So you need to know, what is it going to be? And you need to be very practical about what can you do and how does it work. If you need to do an interview and you don't like doing interviews, why choose something that requires you to do an interview? So it's a very practical thing. And also in there, sometimes there are certain questions that require a longer time to study. There could be something that you want to do a time over, say, 5 years, that you want to measure something. And in fact, do you have 5 years to finish your degree? All of these things are to enable you to decide. Now, when you look at your evidence, it's quite important to understand things about the evidence that you can put together. You have evidence that you can absolutely control what evidence you're generating, and you have it as primary data. Lab experiments. I put that in place, I do exactly this, and what comes out, I can control exactly. Nothing surprising can happen. Field experiments, you've got a lower level of control because there are some variables in there that you can't control. Program evaluation studies, you have lower control, and it's not always primary data, it's a mix. If you have secondary data, for a lot of modeling kind of thing, you use secondary data, you have some level of control, but it's secondary data. All the way through to participatory action research, where both you and another entity is part of that research process. So your control is very little. You can't go around generating books. There are multiple sources of control. Discourse analysis, very little control, and you're typically dealing with secondary data. You're analyzing how certain discourses are occurring. Now, this comes from Yin. It's an old version of Yin, and it really tells you about what evidence and what you have to understand about evidence. Now, this is not a complete set, but what it should tell you is that there are always strengths according to certain sources of evidence and weaknesses to certain sources of evidence. This comes from a book about case study methodology that inherently require you to use multiple sources of evidence, because some have strengths, some have weaknesses, and you're trying to build up a complementary set of evidence to come to a certain conclusion. Now, if you're only going for interviews in your research, if you don't construct your questions properly, you have an issue. Response bias is an issue. people don't recall what happened, or just, the simple thing of having your memory slightly changed. Now, I don't remember it the way it really happened because I don't like the way it really happened. I'm going to have a selective memory. And then reflexivity, sometimes people just give you what they want to hear. But every single source of evidence have got weaknesses and it has strengths. So when you look at the possible evidence, you've got to understand that evidence, because the kind of evidence that you use in your argument is going to say something about what you can answer. It's going to say something about reliability and things like that. Observations, we've spoken about observations earlier. When you do observations, please don't think that I'm going to go in there and I'm going to check it. You're not going to check it. How are you going to go around it? You should either have a very, very structured, positivist kind of, I'm looking for this is the way I'm collecting the evidence, yes, no. Or you should have a certain, the term could be that you need a protocol, but the guys that are really doing phenomenological work prefer to call it a schedule of things that you're looking for. What are you looking for and how you're going to analyze it? So observations are not only going to check it. You've got it's a certain set of evidence, it's a very valuable set of evidence, but you've got to go around it correctly. Now, your research design really talks about how you are going to get the evidence to answer your empirical questions. It could be, and in some cases, your research design is a detailed recipe. This. In some forms of design, you would give a roadmap. You would have, I am going to go around doing the following in order to get my answers. Or it could be, I will do exactly that. There's different ways, and there's different ways in which you actually structure your research design. What is very, very important is that your readers should be able to see exactly how you're going to go about that. And your proposal, that is incredibly important. Just because you know how you're going to go about it doesn't mean that your reader can follow your mind. And we're going to go through some of the examples that you've got to be very, very clear, even if you can't be extremely explicit about exactly what you're going to do. If you just have, say, a research schedule instead of a research protocol. And that depends. Ultimately, you have to demonstrate that you've thought about how you're going to do your research, how you're going to collect that evidence. And at your proposal, when you put together your research proposal to go through the faculty committee, that is one of the key aspects. Are you going to, have you thought about it? And your criticism will be, for most of you, the criticism will focus on your research design if you've conceptualized the rest. The book Saunders, which we've recommended, use this model. Okay, I'm going to unpack a lot of it now, so don't worry about it. But it really talks about the research onion. And the way that Saunders go about explaining how to do your research design is that you've got to slowly skin that onion from the outside, and you make decisions from the outside going in. And you can't skip a layer. Now, the research proposal that you have to do has got a diagram that also illustrates these steps. And that diagram works very well if you're doing traditional positivist research. If you're not doing positivist research, it may just confuse you. But it takes you through the steps of making those decisions. But let's go through them. The outside layer of the research, which Saunders referred to as your strategic choices. It's really from your philosophical, your epistemological perspective. Are you looking at positivism? Are you looking at realism? Are you looking at interpretivism? Are you looking at pragmatism? Pragmatism basically says, I will use whatever I need to in answer to use a question. And I'm not going to have anything influence the way that I put together those. Okay. So, am I going to use induction, abduction, or deduction? If we go through those things, I'll just do the descriptions now. You have to understand your philosophical beliefs and you have to articulate it. If you haven't articulated how you thought about it, your reader is going to assume something. And if that assumption is not in line with what you really thought, there could be a lot of difficulties. At a doctoral level, you really have to be very explicit and understand and demonstrate your understanding of what that philosophical belief does. Now, your next level of strategic questions is how you're going to go about building your argument. Are you going to be deductive? I'll do the diagram now, that I look at it, premise, draw a conclusion, etc. Or am I going to inductive or bottom-up approach? Or I'm going to use abduction. And the best way to tell abduction is I'm going to take my most likely. It's not either this way or that way, but it's cycles of up and down. Deduction, clearly, I start from the theory, I develop a hypothesis, I do my observations, and I say, yes, it works. Straightforward. Induction. I'm having observations, I'm seeing patterns, I'm sort of forming a theory, a hypothesis, and then I do my theory. It's different approaches. And abductive is that basically I don't have really a whole set of observations, and I'm looking at these observations for the most likely explanation. Okay? It's a process of reasoning the best explanations. You're going from one set of facts, you're looking at the next, and you're moving up and down between them to come to the most reasonable conclusion about what it should be. And possibly the best explanation is that it's detective work. A little bit here, a little bit there, and we get forward. Your tactical choices is a next grouping of your onion decisions. Okay? You're going to talk about what approach you're going to follow and how you're going to go around analyzing the evidence. You're not really talking about exactly what's the instrument, data collection, data analysis, but you have to actually have an understanding of what you're going to do. The first decision is around your methodological choice. Am I going to be qualitative, mono method, qualitative, a single method? And when I talk about method here, I'm talking about the detail of collecting data. Am I going to do a survey, single survey? Am I going to use more than one method of collecting quantitative data, qualitative data, or am I going to use a mixed method? Okay, the next level is around my strategy. Now, the terminology used for the next tier is quite wide. Some textbooks refer to that as my research design inherently. Saunders refers to that as my strategy. But basically, that is incredibly important when you start articulating how you're going to do. And some of those strategies are strongly aligned with certain epistemological traditions. And even more important, if that strategy is not congruent with the kind of question that you've asked, your kind of problem, immediately there will be questions around it. The next layer is then whether you're going to do cross-sectional, certain points in time, or whether you're going to do longitudinal across a timeline. Okay. Basically, it's your methodological choices. A methodology here refers to the procedural framework that you're going to go through. In other words, the strategies. So very often when you say research methodology, people will only refer to what strategy. I'm going to follow case study research. This is my research methodology. Okay. But the method talks to the various ways that you're collecting and analyzing data. Quantitative or qualitative, every type of data that you're using implies certain beliefs. Okay. You are not going to get far away saying you're doing positivist work, strictly positivist work with qualitative data. People get uncomfortable about that. There's a certain fundamental understanding of how you feel about reality that's aligned with the way you go to. Quantitative implies a positivist, fully quantitative. Fully qualitative implies an interpretivist kind of paradigm. Now, if you do positivist, typically, and please look that case studies comes in here. Case study research is slightly different from case studies. You use case studies in all cases. So you can do a very quantitative case study using purely multiple sources of quantitative data. You can also do a fully qualitative case study using multiple qualitative sources of evidence. Or you could do one with a mixed. And in most cases, when we talk about case study research, we refer to the middle bits. But you can, in fact, go either way. You can do archival research, you can do surveys, you can do experiment. There's a number of typical positivists. And there's some interpretivist. Once again, it's case study, but remember you can go fully case study here now, fully qualitative. Ethnography, totally interpretivist. Action research, probably somewhere in the middle, and you're going to use multiple sources of evidence. Grounded theory, interpretivist. And I wouldn't recommend you to go there because it's very painful and takes a long time. Narrative inquiry, interpretivist. And participatory inquiry is very interpretivist. However, in some cases you mix them. Now there's a number of reasons why you're mixing, and there's different layers at which you can mix. And you have to have very good reasons for mixing, and you have to understand that mixing. If you start mixing at a paradigm level, you're probably dealing with a pragmatist paradigm. So just by saying I'm mixing at paradigms means that I'm being pragmatist. Okay? You could be putting together insufficient argument. So I have both qualitative and quantitative questions in there. You could look at multiple angles. Qualitative gives me one perspective, quantitative gives me a different perspective. You could look at layer the evidence, increase my reliability by having several studies in parallel. You could simply use the argument that in this area, this is the kind of research people do in my academic environment. Some people do it because they think it's fun and is eager to learn. A lot of people basically look at it because it mirrors real life. You know, this is the way you have to do it. And typically your pragmatist would be also going that way. And then your different forms of sub-questions, straightforward. But you will be mixing based on what do you expect to do with that. So when you mix, tell me what kind of reason you have for mixing, what do you want to do with it, and it's quite likely that what will come out of that is a specific kind of mixed method design. If I want to compare different perspectives, I'm going to do a convergent, two qualitative, quantitative at the same time in parallel. If I want to explain quantitative results with qualitative findings, I'm going to do a sequential one. If I want to go in much more detail after a qualitative study, I'm going to do a sequential with my quantitative following my qualitative. If I want to understand the experiments, I might be doing embedded design, I might be doing a call for action, I might be really looking at transformative designs, and most of your transformative or your critical realist kind of research tend to be mixed in any case. If I want to evaluate in grounded developed design, I'll go through a validation process. And if I want to understand the need, I could do a multi-phase. Now some of you are doing multi-phase, some of you are doing sequential. But what is really important, that the moment you start mixing, that you are very explicit. And if you do a mixed design, you can't go around just putting down a single everything in one grouping, because you can very, very easily confuse your reader. And just because it's clear to you doesn't mean it's clear to everybody else. The first thing, why do you need it? And Green's definition, and some of it's linked to Creswell, the sort of seen as definitive text on mixed research is the book by Creswell. It's not this book, which is this general research design, but it's mixed method book. Talks about different reasons that you would mixing, but probably Green's definition is a little bit clearer. The first reason that you would be mixing, purpose for your mixing, would be to expand my understanding. I use different methods to look at different things. I used one method to look at one bit, expand on my knowledge, okay? Insufficient information. I could triangulate. I could try and do these in parallel so that I can map them and compare my findings and my results, so that I can either improve my reliability or say have more credibility, or that I understand that there's really difference. I can be complementary. Okay, this one is different aspects, etc. You want to, embedded ones tend to be complementary, or it could be development. The one follows logically to the other. I want to identify factors through a qualitative research, and I then want to go and evaluate those factors through quantitative. Or I want to do a quantitative study and then explore those through a qualitative. The key principle is that you're trying to mix the strengths without compromising on mixing too many of the weaknesses. Each one of these, as I said, have a strength, just as each forms of evidence have a strength. And you're trying to be complementary. Strengths and non-overlapping weaknesses. It's very important, and this comes from Creswell. Doing mixed research doesn't mean that you can do any version of that in a half-assed way. It means that your collection has to be thorough, both qualitatively and quantitatively. It means that you've got to be able to analyze both quantitatively and qualitatively. It means that you have to integrate the data sources. It means that you have to actually understand how you're going to design it and actually articulate that design. And you have to understand the philosophical approach that you're following. What is it that is informing that? There's several decisions, and Creswell, I think most of this comes from Creswell, basically states that there are certain things, and these are not mapped. If you've made one decision, the rest follows. You've got to make a firm decision about how am I going to look at this mixing. Am I going to do them sequential? Am I going to do them so concurrently? Am I going to do the sequential with qualitative first or with quantitative first? Or am I going to do them embedded? Is my qualitatively going to be more important, my quantitatively be more important, or are they going to be equally important? Where am I going to integrate? Am I going to integrate the data collection? Okay, that I use qualitative and quantitative data at the same time. Am I going to integrate after I've done the analysis? During the analysis, am I going to integrate after I've done the analysis when I'm doing interpretation? Or am I going to combine it to different layers? And all of these things needs to be articulated in your design. And then am I going to have explicit theoretical perspective or implicit theoretical perspective? If you do mixed method, get hold of Creswell and start unpacking there. Okay. Diagrams. This is so. I can do a convergent design. Do the qualitative, and although they come from two sides, you can really look at them coming this. Qualitative, quantitative, I try and put together at my interpretation level. I can do an embedded one, that I do quantitative, I have an intervention, and a quantitative at the end. It's a mix. And I do them fully as embedded design. A lot of designs are those kind. I can explanatory, qualitative, or quantitative with qualitative. Exploratory design is a qualitative followed by a quantitative. I can do a sequential embedded design 1, 1, 1. Or it could be that inherently in my framework there's an up, down process. Participated action research, critical theory, all of those forms of research in a specific environment has a specific framework that is the way they do it. You also find sometimes that you have a multi-phase design, that you're doing certain things, interpreting them, and going on. Now, all of these things is just some descriptions. When you put the thing together and when you put your design and you write down your design, you have to do some level of making people understand how are you putting together your mixed design. You can use diagrams. And in fact, you have to use diagrams because a visual design is a heck of a lot clearer. There's also terminology, and this comes from Creswell, and people where they always do qualitative could use a notation. So they do quant-qual. And the notation that you use is something like that. But if you can't write it and your reader can't read it, it doesn't help at all. So your most sensible way is to put these together and to put in here a little A. And then in your design you go and you expand on that block. And you go expand on your next block so that you can be clear how you're going to do that and your reader can actually follow what on earth you're doing it. Because mixed designs can be really, really difficult to communicate so that your reader can actually follow that. Is that clear? Big happiness. Okay. The time horizon, remember, you can do it cross-sectional, longitudinal. Longitudinal, massive implications around time. If you're doing longitudinal, that you're measuring things every month or so, that's okay. But if you want to measure every year, it already implies that you're going to do several years worth of study, and you don't necessarily want to go there. Cross-sectional, more than one case across at a single point in time. Data become qualitative or quantitative, but you really want to look at correlations. Longitudinal design would be the moment you have change in your problem statement. If you have change in your question, it would tell you somehow that you might be interested in things changing over time. That means you've got to get evidence of things changing over time that has serious practical implications. You also can have things about losing cases. Say you want to investigate how, say, small companies survive, and you want to know what management style is going to lead to the survival of a micro-industry or a startup company. And you start off with, say, 20 companies. First 6 months, 10 of them have failed. 6 months later, 5 of them have failed. Will you have enough cases left after 2 years to be able to say anything, or is there a chance that after 2 years you'll have all your cases gone? So when you deal with longitudinal design, you have to make very certain that you understand what could possibly happen over the time, so you have enough cases at the end to analyze. Okay? So that is one of the issues. Okay. The next level, now we're going into the very internal bit of the onion. We've been going through it systematically. Really goes around my selection and defense or substantiation of that choice of the primary tools of data collection and analysis. And I will go over and over and over about that. You have to look at the data analysis, because if you do not take the way that you're going to analyze into account in your design, you may end up with evidence that you actually needed at the end, and you don't know what you can say. So, and remember, it's not really important to tell me that you're going to use SPSS or Excel. It's a pink pencil, green pen kind of argument. What kind of analysis are you going to commit? You've got to be careful. You've got to be able to talk about your unit of analysis. What is it that you're going to analyze? Are you going to look at an object? Are you going to entity? What is it that you're looking at? Am I looking at the experience of change? And I use certain indicators. Am I looking at what? So if you look at examples, some objects could be physical objects, human beings, cultural objects, social interventions. What is it that I'm analyzing? Okay. Let's go through the tactics. This is now the kind of way, tactics, the strategies that you can go through. And I'm now literally going one step back. We've gone through the whole onion. Lab experiments, field experiments, participant observer approach, large-scale survey, in-depth survey, case study. Action research, forecasting, futures research, simulation, game or role-playing, focus groups. Although focus groups, the issue is that really a different tactic, or is that just the data collection? Ethnography, scenario research. Okay. Lab experiments, you refer to something that is typically modeled on your traditional physical research. So I'm looking at something that I can control a lot of variables. It's very difficult to do this in management research. So how am I going to go? I really want to replicate it. I've done it. I can do it exactly the same. I've controlled for my external variables. It's unlikely that you'll be going to do that. Your highest level of control over your evidence. Field experiments is sometimes I'm doing the same thing, but I'm now doing it in reality. The Hawthorne experiment, the fact where you're going to go around it and you say, let's change the light intensity and see how people's productivity change. That's a field experiment. But because they couldn't take all the variables out, one of the findings there, and it's contested later, but one of the findings there is that, you know what, more light, people do better. Less light, people do better. In fact, people don't care about the light, they care about the attention. And because of the attention. So, but it really limits the questions that you can ask, because you have to do this experiment in the field, and you don't often get permission to do that. It's less positivistic because you can't control for those variables, and you've got to deal with those findings in a more qualitative. So to a large degree, there tends to be a dimension, a total spectrum, and you're not really looking at a point on the spectrum. You're not looking at one extreme or another point, you're looking at the point. Large-scale surveys, you're going to administer questionnaires. You know what your population, you've got your sampling numbers, you're either sampling randomly, you're sampling in a stratified random or something like that. You get a lot of data, you whack it into statistics, very, very positivist logic. Very important here that you go in with your design. A lot of your research qualities in your design, in your item selection, all of those things. Forecasting. Now, forecasting is very important. It's a mathematical progression, and whether it's forecasting or futures, it's all got different layers of understanding. But forecasting, you're really typically using secondary data. You're analyzing and you're projecting forward. Okay? So you need what's happening and you're projecting it forward. And it's very important that you're using statistical techniques, time series, regression analysis, and things like that. Very positivist, although you might be interpreting some of the things. Simulation modeling. Now I can't put it into a computer to whack it. Okay? In this case I'm using a simulation, and I'm saying if I have it in here, I'm simulating this, I'm running certain models. what do I see? You've got to have mathematical background, you've really got to pull them together. And typically you're looking at this environment where I can't go around really doing this in real life. People won't allow me. So I build up models, very, very strongly mathematical models, and I'm trying to predict what will happen. Game playing is also a form of simulation. But now instead of building a model, I'm using people to do that model. So if we go back and remember that example that we used when we discussed ethics, where we're looking at the Stanford prison experiment, where students were selected, some of them were made prison guards, some of them were made inmates, and they were put into a situation and they had to play certain roles. Of course, that one ended up quite badly because people really enjoyed their roles, especially the prison warders, and the whole thing had to be aborted. You're basically putting people into a situation and you're making them do something to learn what is going to happen there.